Garry Kasparov, thanks for joining me on UpFront. You would like the West, the United States government, President Obama, NATO, the EU, to take a tougher stance against President Vladimir Putin and against the Russian government. Why?
I would prefer to call him a dictator, to call him who he is. He's in power for nearly 17 years, and he has no intention of leaving power voluntarily. And the problems Putin caused for Russia, as I predicted many times for years, they eventually became everybody's problems, since every dictator, when he runs out of enemies inside the country, he looks for enemies elsewhere, since his propaganda machine needs enemies to keep his subjects alarmed about threats that could be a justification of unlimited stay in power.
Okay, but there's no actual evidence, is there, that a more aggressive or confrontational stance by the West against Russia would make Vladimir Putin less authoritarian or less dictatorial, to use your phrase, or make the average Russian or Crimean more free? There's no evidence that more aggression on the West part would achieve that solution.
I don't like the word aggression, I prefer the word deterrence. Unless we ignore history completely, we should learn a simple lesson. That early deterrence always saved lives because it prevented an aggressor from further actions. And appeasement always led to more confrontations and eventually to big wars. As I said, deterrence in case of Georgia in 2008, stronger action after Putin's annexation of Crimea in March 2014, could, helped Eastern Ukrainians to avoid a nightmare, and stronger actions against Putin in Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine could have helped thousands and maybe tens of thousands of lives of innocent Syrians that are being carpet bombed by Putin.
But what does a deterrent look like against Russia, in your view? Would you like to see a military confrontation with Russia? Would you want to see a confrontation over the skies of Syria or on the ground in Ukraine? Surely that's what would lead to another world war. That would risk nuclear war.
That's totally false premises, because again, from history we know that early deterrence prevented wars. During the Cold War, America and Europe faced Soviet Union, which was much more powerful than Vladimir Putin. And we know that strong stand of presidents like Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan eventually, stopped Soviet aggression in many parts of the world. It looked very dangerous, but we know that the opposite ideas of deterrent, of appeasement, they led to tougher confrontations. In case of Ukraine, it was very simple. From the very beginning, the West could impose strong sanctions on Russian companies, on Russian banks, and support Ukraine with lethal weapons. Nobody talked about boots on the ground.
But they have imposed strong sanctions, Gary. The US has imposed tough sanctions on Russia's biggest bank, on Russian defense companies.
Just don't insult my intellect. Look, they did impose sanctions, but first of all, there are so many more things that they could have done by preventing Putin from moving further, because at the end of the day, dictator depends on his entourage, on his inner circle. And so far, all these people could see is a weakness on the side of the West, of the free world, and toughness and confidence on Putin's side. And also, sanctions is not just about, concrete measures that are being imposed today. It's about psychological climate. Every month, every week, every day, we are hearing noises from many European countries, even in the United States, about lifting sanctions. And as long as dictator can project, his strengths, telling his people that sanctions will be lifted maybe next month, maybe in 6 months, maybe soon, the effect of the sanctions, psychological effect, is being lost.
Maybe that's because studies show that sanctions don't always work and harm ordinary people. But just on your specific point about providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, that's not going to defeat Putin either, is it? The international relations scholar John Mearsheimer says advocates of arming Ukraine fail to understand that for Russian leaders, Ukraine is one of their core strategic interests. They're not going to give ground. They will absorb huge costs. The West can't absorb the same costs because Ukraine is not a core strategic interest for the West in the way it is for Putin. That's just a reality, isn't it, Gary?
Look, this is the oldest experts. They are insulting 45 million Ukrainians. Ukraine is not a buffer state. I heard this language in 1938, in 1939. All these predecessors of these so-called political experts, they have been saying that Czechoslovakia, Poland, Eastern Europe is not important for the security of France, Britain, and the free world. You know, it's insulting, you know, to make an assumption that Ukrainians, they are doomed to be part of the Russian Empire as long as Kremlin wants it.
But Garry, aren't you insulting?
No, I'm not insulting
Aren't
anybody.
you insulting the intelligence of viewers who are hearing you say that Putin is this new Hitler, he's expansionist, he's threatening, he's aggressive, but if we provide some lethal weapons to the Ukrainian government, he'll run away. He's not going to run away. You're just going to escalate the conflict.
It's not about running away, you know. It's about providing people in Ukraine or in any other nation that is fighting against aggression comfort and psychological confidence that the free world is behind them. Don't forget, in 1994, and maybe your viewers, very intelligent viewers, are not aware of the fact that in 1994, under pressure from the United States and the United Kingdom, Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world to Russians, receiving guarantees of its territorial integrity.
No one's questioning that point, Garry. It's a very good point you make. But what do you do about it? You are not telling us what is your military solution. Garry, what is your military solution in Ukraine? Do you believe there should be a war between NATO and Russia in Ukraine on the ground? What is your solution?
The problem is eventually, if Putin crosses Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian border, which he could do, then he will be confronting NATO. And that's, again, going back to the 30s, going back to any other confrontation between the free world and dictators in the past. We know that appeasement always encouraged dictators to move further. Dictators never ask why, they always ask why not. They're not stopped before being stopped by someone else.
Do you want the US government to try and topple Vladimir Putin, to try and push for his departure from power? Because even under Ronald Reagan, who you greatly admired, he worked with Mikhail Gorbachev. He signed treaties with him to end the Cold War. It was never the US policy to try and be anti the leader of the Soviet Union, as you want it to be today. You want it to be anti-dictator Putin, you say.
Look, you know, if you mention Reagan, don't forget that Gorbachev at that time was forced to negotiate because the Soviet Union was badly losing the war in Afghanistan, thanks, by the way, to the supply of lethal weapons to Afghan rebels by the US government. And negotiating is a great thing. And I'm all in favor of diplomacy. I'm not in favor of abandoning your own principles and giving up territories, countries, and nations to the aggressor. Reagan never conceded anything to communism. And by the way, Reagan faced Soviet Union. And don't tell me that Vladimir Putin today is more dangerous than Stalin's Soviet Union, Brezhnev's, or Andropov's.
How clever, how strategically brilliant is Vladimir Putin in your view? A lot of Republican politicians in the US have said that Putin is playing chess while Obama is playing checkers. As a former chess grandmaster yourself, do you rate Putin as a chess player on the geopolitical stage? Is he a master strategist?
No, absolutely not. You know, I have to defend the integrity of my game. Dictators don't play chess because chess is a transparent game. Everything done by your opponent is in front of you. Dictators, they are more like poker players because they prefer to bluff. They can play with a very weak hand by raising stakes and checking the resilience of their opponents. And unfortunately, there are many situations in the current geopolitical affairs where the leaders of the free world, starting with Obama, fold cards while having a very, very strong hand.
Isn't it the case that for all his authoritarianism, for all the crackdowns on civil liberties and on the media in Russia, for all the questions that have rightly been raised about how free or fair his election victories have been, Vladimir Putin, regardless, is still a popular leader at home. Russians have rallied around him. They see him as a strong defender of Russian power and prestige in a hostile and turbulent world.
Look, you know, if you have only one restaurant in town and only one dish served in this restaurant, this dish will be very popular. Russian propaganda machine, you know, controls the entire media space, 24/7 propaganda, which could be even worse than in the Soviet Union because at least in old days, there were some bright ideas about the future, though of course we knew these ideas were fakes, but at least they pretended that they were looking for some kind of bright future. While today, Putin's propaganda machine is the most poisonous I ever heard of. And it's all about confrontation. It's all about enemies. But we don't know what Russian people really think because we never had, for a very long time, free and fair elections, and Putin never was a part of a single debate.
You say we don't know what they think. A peer-reviewed study by 4 US academics last year concluded our estimates suggest support for Putin of approximately 80%. We conclude that Putin's approval ratings largely reflect the attitudes of Russian citizens. You're in a minority, Garry. You can blame the media or propaganda, but the fact is you're in a minority amongst your fellow Russians, aren't you, when it comes to Putin?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. If these academics run a survey in Nazi Germany or in Stalin's Soviet Union, they would find 100% of support. You know, it's just, when you have a dictator in power, how can you expect people to be honest when they are responding to a question asked by, anonymously by the telephone or by a stranger who is asking them on the street or knocking at their door?
This study actually took into account your criticism. It didn't actually ask specifically about Putin. But just moving on to you yourself and where you live now. You live abroad. You don't live in Russia. Are you living abroad because you fear for your life? Or are you living abroad because you can't work freely in Russia?
Yeah, I can go back, but I will never be able to leave the country. Vladimir Putin's most vocal opponents, either in jail, in exile, or dead. That's a fact. And yeah, again, we look at the state of domestic affairs in Russia, so-called elections, and it's totally dominated by Vladimir Putin and his cronies. Nobody can do anything through the legal process. And again, he's in power for 17 years, and he's not going anywhere. It's a dictatorship. You know, we heard many people defending either Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, you know, before it became unbearable. But you heard a lot of talks about, you know, Adolf Hitler in 1936 or 1937, or about Stalin at the same time. That, of course, you know, it's not democratic, but the moment I hear this but about Vladimir Putin, I'm thinking about people who are being burned alive now in Syria, where Vladimir Putin's carpet bombs, you know, Syrian hospitals and schools, supporting his crony Bashar al-Assad, a butcher of Damascus.
You tried to run for president almost a decade ago, back in 2007. Do you hope to one day run again? Sounds like not. If Russia is Nazi Germany in the making, clearly you can never go back and you'll never ever have a free political system, from what you're saying.
Oh, yeah. By the way, I just, you know, let me tell you and your listeners, I will come back to Russia. Vladimir Putin is a dictator, and every dictator ends up, you know, the same way. Whether it's like Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, but he's going to disappear, and it will be a very, you know, painful end for Vladimir Putin and his cronies. The question is not what happens with Putin. The question is when it happens and what price my country and the rest of the world will pay for the demise of this brutal dictator.
Garry Kasparov, thanks for joining me on UpFront.